There's a YouTube video going around of Jon Stewart, who's the host of The Daily Show. And he had a Q&A with his audience last month. And one of the audience members asked Jon Stewart what role faith played in his life. And Jon Stewart replied that he isn't against religion, but faith has never played a role in his life. And what he said was, I wished I could get there, but I can't. I've never been a belief guy. I've always been this guy, that if God is all-powerful, why do children die? Jon Stewart said that he wants to believe in God, but it is that the tragedies and the suffering of this world that keeps him from faith in God. And it's not just secular television personalities who struggle with this. A few years ago, some dear friends of ours who we used to go to church with, they lost their child. Their baby fell asleep or died while in their sleep. And that tragedy caused the father of that child to walk away from his faith in God. And maybe this morning you are in a similar place. Maybe you'd like to believe in God, but when you look at all the tragedy and the suffering in this world, your only conclusion is either God doesn't care, or God isn't powerful enough, or, as was concluded by my friend and Jon Stewart, maybe all this suffering just proves that God doesn't exist at all. Even for those of us who still believe in God, I know that there are for all of us those late nights when we're alone with our thoughts, when we're feeling the weight of our pain and our suffering and our grief, and we start to wonder, does God really care? Does God really care about me and my troubles? And if you have ever wondered that, you are in good company. Because today, as we continue our sermon series through the Gospel of Mark, and we come to Mark chapter 4, we're going to look at this story, and the disciples are finding themselves in a life-threatening crisis, and they cry out and say, Jesus, do you care that we are perishing? And as we study this story together, my hope for you is that you would know and believe that no matter what stress or whatever circumstance you find yourself today, you can indeed have confidence that Jesus does indeed care for you deeply. And we're going to see that today from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. But before we do that, let's set the context for this passage. Let's remind ourselves where we are in the book of Mark. We've been going through Mark for some time now. And so I want to set both the physical and the spiritual setting of where we are when we come to this story. So we start with the physical setting, which is in chapter 4, verse 1. It says, and he began to teach beside the sea. And a very large crowd gathered about him so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea. And the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables. So picture the scene. Jesus is there on the Sea of Galilee. He's teaching, and there's so many people who want to hear him that they're starting to crowd him, that he's starting to end up in the water. His feet are starting to get wet. So he enters into a boat, and it says he sits down, and he teaches from there. The boat has kind of become his pulpit, and floating there on the shore, he teaches as the crowd listens from the land. So that's the physical setting, but there's also a spiritual setting that's taking place from this chapter as well, because there is sort of this spiritual deafness that permeates the crowd. Take a look at what it says in verse 33. It says, with many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples, he explained everything. So the crowd, for the most part, didn't grasp what Jesus was saying. They didn't have, as it says earlier in chapter 4, ears to hear Jesus. They couldn't understand his teaching. And even the disciples who were getting these private explanations of what the parables meant still had trouble figuring out who Jesus is and what he was talking about. They had been given the secrets to the kingdom of God, but they still didn't fully comprehend yet what it is that he was saying, and more importantly, who he was. And this theme of spiritual deafness is something that sets the stage for the dramatic events that we're going to see here, starting in verse 35. So let's take a look again in verse 35. On that day, when the evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with them. So Jesus has been teaching all day long. Afternoon is turning into the evening, and Jesus suggests, let's cross the lake. Let's get out of here and cross the lake. It's about 5 miles to cross the lake at that particular place. And without Jesus, Jesus doesn't even bother to get out of the boat. The same boat that he's been teaching in all day, they take that boat and they start across. And it says that there's other boats with them as they cross the sea. The main thing I want you to note here, however, is that it's Jesus' idea to cross the lake. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Let's keep going. Verse 37, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now, the body of water that they're crossing is the Sea of Galilee, and it's a large freshwater lake. It's about 13 miles long. It's about 8 miles wide. And what's really remarkable about this lake, or the Sea of Galilee, is that the surface of the lake is 700 feet below sea level. So it's in this deep valley. And on the north and the east and the west side, there are these steep mountains that rise up from the lake. And 30 miles to the north of the lake, there's the 9,000-foot tall Mount Hermon. And what would typically happen from time to time, still happens today, is that the cold air from the mountains would come down off the mountains and would mix with the warm air rising up the lake, and it would cause these windstorms. And because the lake is fairly shallow, those windstorms would kick up the waves as much as high as 10 feet tall. Now remember that at least 4 of these disciples are professional fishermen who have been spending their whole life fishing on this very lake. So they know the weather patterns of this lake. So when this storm hits, these are seasoned fishermen who are panicking. They're not overreacting. This is truly a dire situation. Their concern for their safety is well placed. If they're afraid, you know that it's a real issue. And where is Jesus when all of this is happening? Is he panicked? Is he concerned? He's asleep in the stern on a cushion. I mean, just imagine the situation. You're in the boat with the disciples. The wind is howling around you. The waves are crashing over the boat. The boat's starting to fill up with water. The disciples are panicked. They're freaking out. And where's Jesus? He's on a pillow on the back of the boat, asleep. So the disciples wake Jesus up and they rebuke him and they say, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" And this question introduces a remarkable literary device that the author of the gospel is using. Because Mark is going to structure this entire story around 4 questions. And each of these questions will build upon each other to convey the point of the story. And so as we go through this passage, I want you to pay attention to the 4 questions being asked in Mark 4, 35 to 41. And the first question is what we've already seen. The disciples ask Jesus, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" The disciples are in a panic, and Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat. How could he be asleep? We're about to die here, Jesus. And Jesus is sleeping through it all. He either doesn't know what's going on, or he knows and he just doesn't care. Have you been there before? Have you been in a situation where the situation seems dire? Maybe it's a health issue. Maybe it's a relationship that's falling apart. Maybe it's financial difficulty. Maybe it's crippling anxiety or depression. And you pray out to God and it just seems like God is silent. Your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. They're not even getting to him. And you're sitting there in your metaphorical storm. Your boat is filling with water. And you begin to wonder, God, do you care? I'm about to perish and God's asleep in the back of the boat. If you have walked with Jesus for very long, you will know that this is not an uncommon experience, even for those of us who call Jesus our Savior. And throughout Scripture, we see people who in the middle of crisis call out and doubt God's love and doubt God's care. Consider Psalm 13. "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Consider and answer me, lest I sleep the sleep of death." Or how about Psalm 22? Psalm 22 is the psalm that Jesus quoted while on the cross. my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer. And by night, and I find no rest. If you find yourself questioning God's care for you in the middle of crisis, you're in good company. David does so. Even Jesus from the cross does so. So it's okay for us to cry out and to ask God, where are you? Why aren't you listening to me? Do you not care? The question, though, is where do you go next with those doubts? Because for many people, the only logical answer is that God must not care, or God would have never allowed the storm in the first place. So the first of our 4 questions today is what the disciples asked Jesus. Teacher, do you not care? Look at how Jesus responds to the disciples' question, starting in verse 39. And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. So Jesus wakes up from his nap, and he rebukes the wind, and he commands the sea to become still. Now, I think our English translation here tames down Jesus' words a little bit too much. I don't think Jesus is saying to the storm, hey, peace, just kind of chill out. It's a command. He's stating this with authority. And the word here, be still, it's the same Greek word used to muzzle an animal. So I think it's more a picture of Jesus saying, shut up and sit down. And what's incredible is not that Jesus rebukes the wind and the sea. What's incredible is what? The wind and the sea obey. The wind and the sea obey. And the lake becomes perfectly still, like glass. Jesus has just demonstrated that he commands the weather, that he has authority over all of creation, and he does it with what? His words. His words. Here's how the late Timothy Keller describes Jesus' rebuke of the storm. Keller says, he didn't brace himself, roll up his sleeves, raise a wand. There were no incantations. To a hurricane, Jesus simply says, quiet, be still, just like you would talk to an unruly child. See, Jesus doesn't conjure up a higher power. He's not using magic. He simply says, shut up. And Jesus doesn't have access to power. Jesus is the power over the storm. Colossians 1:16 and 17 says this about Jesus, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authority. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Jesus is Lord over all creation. He not only created the universe, he sustains it. He holds it together. He has authority over creation. Jesus is the Lord of the storm, and Jesus is Lord over whatever circumstances you happen to be in today. Jesus then asks the second of our 4 questions. At verse 40, he said to them, why are you so afraid? Does it seem strange that Jesus would ask this question? I mean, it seems pretty obvious why they're afraid. I mean, they're in the middle of a storm that's about ready to sink the boat. They have reason to be afraid. I mean, they had legitimately assessed the risk, and the boat was sinking, and it was highly likely that they all, including Jesus, would drown. Why are you so afraid? That kind of seems like not a very good question, Jesus. Seems pretty obvious. But Jesus doesn't question their bravery here because they're mistaken about the threat posed by the storm. Rather, he's questioning their bravery because they were mistaken about his care for them and about his power to overcome the situation. Which is why then Jesus answers the third of our 4th questions in the second half of verse 40. He says, have you still no faith? In order for us to understand what Jesus is asking in this question, we first need to understand a little bit about the nature of faith. Because a lot of times when we face difficulties or hard times, people, even non-Christians, will say, well, you just need to have faith. Just have faith. And what does that mean when someone says that? Because honestly, faith in and of itself has no control over your circumstances. When people say just have faith, what they're saying is maybe if you just wish or hope hard enough, things will get better. But that's not faith. That's just wishful thinking. That kind of faith is worthless. Because you see, it's not the strength of your faith that matters. Instead, it's where you place your faith that matters. And your faith is only as good as the object of your faith. Imagine you're about to sit in a chair, and you look at that chair and you think, I have a lot of faith that that chair could hold me. Or you look at that chair and you say, I don't have very much faith that that chair is going to hold me. But does your assessment of whether or not that chair can hold you make any difference? The only thing that matters is not how much you believe in the chair. What only matters is how strong is the chair. Because it's the chair's strength, not how strongly you believe, that'll keep you from falling. And so Jesus is not asking the disciples, hey, why didn't you just believe harder? If you just had believed more that the storm would go away, then everything would have been fine. No, what he's asking him is this: how is it that you still do not believe in me? Specifically, they needed to believe three things about Jesus. First, they needed to believe in the power of Jesus over the storm. Secondly, they needed to believe in the purpose of Jesus in the storm. And third, they needed to believe in the person of Jesus, the Lord of the storm. So first, they needed to believe in the power of Jesus over the storm. The disciples had seen Jesus perform a lot of miracles up till now. He'd healed the lame man. He'd cast out demons. He healed someone of leprosy. And based upon what they had already seen, they should have known that Jesus had the power to overcome the storm. Secondly, they needed to believe in Jesus' purpose in the storm. Think about it. The storm was no accident. This didn't catch Jesus by surprise. And remember, it is Jesus who directed them into the storm. It was his idea to cross the lake, and he knew the storm was coming. In other words, Jesus intentionally put them in the path of the storm because he had a purpose for it. And the disciples should have known by that time that sometimes Jesus places us in the storm for a specific purpose and for our good. And they needed to trust Jesus' purpose for the storm. And finally, and most importantly, they needed to believe in the person of Jesus, that he was the Lord of the storm. Which leads us then to our fourth and final question, which is in verse 41. And they were filled with great fear. And they said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? You ever think, why is it that they asked each other this question instead of asking Jesus? Why didn't they go to Jesus and say, he's in the boat with them, and just say, Jesus, who are you? They don't talk to Jesus at all. They're talking to each other, asking each other who Jesus is. Why is that? I think the answer for that is found in the first part of the verse where it says, they were filled with great fear. The disciples were afraid. Now, the disciples had been afraid of the storm, and rightly so. I mean, the boat was about to sink. But now the disciples aren't afraid of the storm anymore. The sea's calm. So what are they afraid of? They're afraid of Jesus. And this passage says that they are filled with great fear. The Greek word for great fear here are two Greek words you already know. It's mega and phobia. In other words, the disciples had mega phobia of Jesus. Why? Because they were in the presence of someone who had the power to command the weather itself. And when they're confronted by Jesus' power and authority, they don't look at each other and think, oh, that was a neat trick. No, they are terrified for their life. They're actually more afraid now that the storm is calm than before when they were in the middle of the storm. If they thought that they were in danger with the storm, they consider themselves more in danger to be in the presence of someone who can actually calm the storm. Think about that. Why are they so afraid? Well, we fear the things that we can't control. The disciples were afraid of the storm because it was out of their control. They couldn't manage it anymore. The storm was too powerful for them. But now that Jesus has demonstrated his power over the storm, the disciples are even more afraid. Why? Because they realize they can't control or manage Jesus either. And you know what? And Jesus isn't doing what they expected him to do. You see, I think their initial question, do you care, presumed something. I don't think that they woke up Jesus and were trying to get him to come and calm the storm. I don't think they expected him to calm the storm at all. I think they expected Jesus to bail out the boat. Come on, Jesus, grab a bucket. Let's get this thing bailed out. Wake up and help us. In other words, Jesus didn't answer their prayer the way they expected him to. Jesus doesn't help them bail out the boat at all because he doesn't answer the prayers the way they expect. And instead, when he stops the storm, it scares them more than the storm itself. And I think sometimes when we doubt Jesus' care for us, It's primarily because Jesus isn't answering our prayers the way we want him to. Jesus, why aren't you solving my problem? Jesus, why haven't you fixed my circumstances? Jesus, why aren't you bailing out my boat? But Jesus won't be controlled and manipulated by our prayers. And he rarely answers our prayers the way we expect him to. Our prayer, therefore, shouldn't be, Lord, help me bail out the boat. Instead, we should pray that we would have the faith to believe in his solution and in his timing. And instead of telling Jesus how to fix our problems, we need to faithfully believe in his ability to calm the storm, but also to believe in his timing and to believe in his deep care for us as he rides with us through the storm. So the disciples, because of their great fear, ask each other this question: who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Isn't it fascinating that Mark never answers that question? He just kind of leaves it hanging there, doesn't he? He just leaves it hanging there. In fact, Mark never gives us an answer to any of the 4 questions we see in this passage. Instead, these questions are structured so incredibly masterfully by Mark that they build on each other, and they work so that if you can answer the final question, it actually answers all the questions that come before it. So, for example, that if we answer that final question, who then is this? We will discover that Jesus is someone in whom I can place my faith. And that then answers our third question: why do you still not have any faith? And if I've placed my faith in Jesus, then that answers the second question: why are you so afraid? Because if I put my faith in Jesus, I have nothing to fear. And if I have nothing to fear, then that answers the first question: do you care? We will know indeed that he does care. So the real answer to all 4 questions is found completely in the answer to the last one: who is Jesus? Because if you know who Jesus is and you place your faith in him, you will have no reason to fear, and you'll have no reason to doubt his care for you. So this whole passage depends on how we answer that final question, doesn't it? Who is this then that even the wind and the sea obey him?